June 15, 1944. Dawn breaks over Saipan. The first rays of sunlight pierce through the morning mist hovering above the Pacific. Japanese Lieutenant Colonel Takashi Hirakushi stands at his observation post on Mount Tapachau, binoculars pressed against his face. Below him, the turquoise waters of the Philippine Sea appear deceptively calm. The air carries the salt tang of the ocean mixed with the earthy smell of volcanic soil. He adjusts his position, scanning the horizon with the methodical precision drilled into him at the Imperial Japanese Army Academy. Then he sees them, dark shapes materializing from the pre-dawn gloom, hundreds of them spreading across the water like locusts descending upon a field. The American fleet. His hands tighten around the binoculars. The invasion he had been preparing for has arrived. But something is wrong. Through the smoke of the initial bombardment, through the chaos of explosions churning the shallow waters into white foam, he sees movement that defies everything he knows about amphibious warfare. Vehicles are emerging from the sea itself, not landing craft depositing troops on the beach, not men wading through neck-deep water under withering fire. These are tanks, actual armored vehicles, driving through the waves as if the ocean were merely another road. They crawl forward with mechanical determination, water cascading off their hulls, their tracks finding purchase on the coral shelf beneath. Hirakushi lowers his binoculars, his mind struggling to reconcile what his eyes are showing him. In all his years of military training, in all the tactical manuals he has studied, in all the intelligence briefings about American capabilities, no one had mentioned this. No one had prepared him for tanks that swim. This moment would mark the beginning of a transformation in Pacific warfare that Japanese commanders had not anticipated, could not have imagined, and would prove powerless to stop. The concept of the amphibious tank was born from innovation, but from necessity, from the brutal lessons learned in blood on the beaches of Tarawa just 7 months earlier. In November 1943, United States Marines had assaulted that tiny atoll in the Gilbert Islands, expecting their landing craft to carry them over the coral reefs and deposit them on the beach. Instead, the tide had been miscalculated. Hundreds of Marines were forced to wade through hundreds of yards of chest-deep water, while Japanese machine guns methodically cut them down. The water turned red, bodies floated in the lagoon. Nearly 1,000 Americans died in 76 hours, many of them drowning under the weight of their own equipment before they ever reached the sand. The High Command knew they could not repeat Tarawa. They could not ask men to walk through that killing zone again. The solution already existed, tucked away in experimental programs and engineering workshops. The Landing Vehicle Tract, or LVT, a design that had begun life as a civilian rescue vehicle for use in the Florida Everglades. Donald Roebling, an heir to the industrial fortune, had created it to reach people stranded in swamps and hurricanes. The military had taken notice. By 1941, the Marines had commissioned armed versions. But it was after Tarawa that the program exploded into urgent priority. Engineers worked around the clock to transform the LVT from a transport vehicle into an armored assault weapon. They mounted cannons on the bow. They added machine guns to rotating turrets. They reinforced the hull with steel plating that could withstand small arms fire and shrapnel. They installed more powerful engines to handle the additional weight. The result was the LVTA, the ACE, standing for armored, a vehicle that could do what no tank in military history had done before: drive off a ship, travel 4 miles through open ocean, climb over a coral reef, and emerge on a hostile beach with its guns already firing. The Japanese High Command operated under assumptions forged in their own experience. Their military doctrine had been shaped by victories in Manchuria, by campaigns in China, by the lightning conquest of Southeast Asia in the war's early years. They understood jungle warfare. They had mastered the art of defensive positions built into caves and reinforced with concrete. Their soldiers were trained to die rather than surrender, to hold every inch of territory until annihilation. When they looked at the Pacific islands they occupied, Saipan, Guam, Tinian, Peleliu, they saw fortresses. They had studied American tactics, noting the dependence on landing craft, the vulnerability of troops in shallow water, the predictable patterns of beach assaults. Their defensive strategy was elegant in its simplicity: fortify the beaches, establish killing zones in the surf, make the Americans pay in blood for every yard of sand. They placed their best artillery on the high ground overlooking the landing zones. They built bunkers with interlocking fields of fire. They laid mines in the shallows. They positioned their machine gun nests to enfilade the beaches, ensuring that anyone who survived the water would still face a gauntlet of lead. They did not account for vehicles that could bypass the killing zone entirely, that could arrive on the beach already in formation, already firing, already providing cover for the infantry following behind. The intelligence reports that reached Tokyo from German allies fighting in North Africa and Europe spoke of American industrial might, of vast quantities of equipment, of seemingly endless supplies. But quantity and quality occupied different universes in the Japanese military mind. They respected American production capacity, but they did not fear American innovation. The reports described American tanks as adequate but unexceptional. The M4 Sherman was reliable but under-armored compared to German Tigers or their own Type 97 Chiha. American soldiers were soft, they believed, raised in comfort, unprepared for the fanaticism of Japanese defense. This combination of views, acknowledgement of American resources coupled with dismissal of American fighting spirit and tactical creativity, would prove catastrophically wrong. At Saipan, as Hirakushi watched those first LVTs emerge from the sea on June 15th, the disconnect between expectation and reality began to shatter Japanese defensive planning. The Americans had launched their assault with a preliminary bombardment that turned the beaches into moonscapes. For hours, naval guns had pounded the shoreline, and Japanese soldiers in their bunkers had endured the shaking earth, the deafening concussions, the terror of being buried alive. When the shelling lifted, they had emerged bloodied but functional, ready to activate their defensive plan. Machine guns were positioned, artillery spotters called in coordinates, officers barked orders, and then the LVTs came. They numbered in the hundreds, wave after wave of them, painted marine green, their tracks churning through the surf, their cannons swiveling toward Japanese positions, even while still partially submerged. The 75mm howitzers, mounted on the LVTA-4 variants, began firing before they touched dry land, suppressing bunkers, destroying machine gun nests, creating havoc in the carefully prepared defensive lines. Behind them came the personnel carriers, the LVT-2s and LVT-4s, each loaded with 20 to 30 Marines who disembarked not into neck-deep water, but onto contested sand with their weapons dry and ready. The psychological impact was immediate. Japanese soldiers who had been told to expect disorganized Americans struggling through the surf instead faced armored vehicles that seemed to violate the natural order, that merged the mobility of ships with the firepower of tanks, that represented a technological leap no intelligence briefing had prepared them for. The commanders on Saipan radioed desperate reports back to headquarters. General Yoshitsugu Saito, leading the defense of the island, found his carefully constructed battle plan unraveling. His beach defenses, designed to slaughter Americans in the water, were being bypassed. His artillery, positioned to target landing craft and troops in the surf, struggled to adjust to armored vehicles already ashore and moving inland. The Americans were not following the expected pattern. They were not being funneled into the killing zones. They were not dying in sufficient numbers to be turned back. By nightfall on June 15th, more than 20,000 Marines were ashore on Saipan. The Japanese had killed hundreds, wounded thousands, destroyed dozens of LVTs. But they had not stopped the landing. They had not thrown the Americans back into the sea. For the first time in the Pacific War, A major Japanese stronghold was being overrun, not despite their defenses, but because those defenses had been rendered obsolete by a vehicle most Japanese commanders had never heard of. The transformation was not merely tactical but symbolic. The LVT represented something deeper than military innovation. It embodied the American approach to war itself, the belief that industrial ingenuity could overcome any obstacle, that problems had engineering solutions, that the distance between civilian creativity and military application could be collapsed when necessity demanded. Donald Roebling's swamp rescue vehicle had become an instrument of liberation, carrying men who had been farmers and shopkeepers and factory workers across an ocean to storm an island most had never heard of in defense of principles many struggled to articulate. The Japanese commanders, trained in a military culture that valued spirit over material, courage over technology, found themselves confronting an enemy that refused to choose, that combined ferocious fighting will with mechanical superiority, that attacked not with reckless bravery alone, but with calculated innovation backed by assembly lines that never stopped. Throughout the Marianas Campaign, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, the pattern repeated. Japanese defenders prepared for one kind of battle and faced another. On Tinian, the Americans used LVTs to feint at one beach while actually landing at another, the vehicle's versatility allowing rapid redeployment that kept Japanese forces off balance. On Guam, where the terrain was even more treacherous, the amphibious tanks proved their worth by navigating coral reefs that would have gutted conventional landing craft, by climbing over barriers natural and man-made, by providing mobile fire support in the chaotic first hours when the battle hung in the balance. The casualty ratios, while still horrific by any measure, told the story. At Tarawa, where Marines had waded through the water, casualties exceeded 30% in some units. In the Marianas, with LVTs leading the assault, the percentage dropped substantially. Thousands of Americans who would have died in the surf lived to fight inland. Thousands more reached the beach with dry ammunition, functional radios, and the morale boost of knowing their military had given them tools equal to the task. The Japanese never developed an effective counter to the LVT. Their anti-tank weapons, designed for use against conventional armor approaching over land, proved less effective against vehicles emerging from the sea at unpredictable points along a coastline. Their artillery, which might have destroyed LVTs in the water, was increasingly suppressed by American naval gunfire and air support so overwhelming that Japanese batteries were often destroyed before they could acquire targets. By the time of the Philippines campaign in late 1944, Japanese commanders had absorbed the lesson but lacked the means to respond. Their intelligence reports now meticulously documented LVT capabilities, noted their weaknesses: thin armor vulnerable to concentrated fire, mechanical reliability issues in salt water, limited fuel range. But knowing the threat and stopping it occupied different realities. The industrial capacity to produce countermeasures did not exist. The tactical flexibility to respond to rapidly evolving American doctrine had atrophied in a military culture that valued adherence to plan over adaptation to circumstance. The symbolic power of the amphibious tank extended beyond the battlefield. In newsreels shown in American theaters, in photographs published in Life magazine, the LVT became an icon of American technological prowess and determination. Audiences watched grainy footage of these machines emerging from the ocean like primordial creatures, water streaming from their hulls, guns blazing, Marines charging down the ramps. It was a visual representation of national character, unstoppable, innovative, bridging the impossible gap between sea and land. For a generation of Americans, the image of those tanks climbing the beaches would become inseparable from the narrative of inevitable victory, of a nation that could adapt to any challenge, overcome any obstacle, defeat any enemy through the combination of industrial might and inventive spirit. On the Japanese side, the amphibious tanks became something different, a harbinger of defeat, a symbol of the widening gap between what their military could achieve and what their enemy could deploy. In private journals and letters, in debriefings of the few prisoners who survived, Japanese officers returned again and again to the shock of that first encounter. They had expected bravery from Americans, had respected their willingness to attack fortified positions. But they had not expected this fusion of imagination and execution, this willingness to fundamentally reimagine the tools of war. It violated their understanding of American character as they had constructed it: soft, undisciplined, dependent on material advantage to compensate for lack of fighting spirit. The LVTs suggested something more dangerous, an enemy that possessed both overwhelming resources and the creative intelligence to deploy them effectively, that could learn from mistakes and institutionalize solutions, that fought not just with courage but with systematic innovation. As the war ground toward its conclusion, as the island-hopping campaign brought American forces ever closer to the Japanese home islands, the amphibious tank remained a constant presence. At Iwo Jima in February 1945, LVTs landed Marines on black volcanic sand, while Japanese defenders hidden in Mount Suribachi's caves watched helplessly as the machines that should not exist continued to exist, continued to deliver their cargo of determined men, continued to symbolize everything that had gone wrong with Japan's calculations about American will and capability. At Okinawa, in April, the last major island battle, the same story played out on a larger scale. Hundreds of LVTs, thousands of vehicles produced in American factories and shipped across the world's largest ocean to assault the threshold of Japan itself. The water lapping at Saipan's beaches still carries echoes of that June morning in 1944, of the moment when Japanese commanders realized their defenses were obsolete, their assumptions shattered. The LVT was more than a weapon, it was a declaration, a mechanical messenger delivering a truth that no amount of courage or determination could overcome, that the side which could turn a rescue vehicle into an assault tank, which could mobilize an entire nation's industrial capacity in service of tactical innovation, which could cross an ocean with a machine that itself could cross from sea to shore, that side possessed advantages against which there was no defense. In the rust and coral that now cover those old battlefields, in the silence that has replaced the thunder of guns, the legacy remains. Not just victory, but the manner of victory. Not just strength, but the creativity to deploy that strength in ways the enemy never imagined, never prepared for, never overcame. The amphibious tanks climbed the beaches because American ingenuity demanded they do so, because freedom required not just the willingness to fight, but the wisdom to fight smart. And in that demanding and that wisdom lay the difference between conquest and liberation, between the rigid and the adaptive, between an empire that could not evolve and a democracy that could not be stopped.